The rain was relentless that night, hammering against the windows like tiny fists demanding to be let in. I sat alone in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The house felt cavernous, empty in a way that wasn't just physical. My husband, Daniel, was away again on one of his endless business trips, and the silence had become my only companion. I had always thought I was strong, independent even, but lately, the loneliness had begun to creep in like a slow-moving fog. I sipped my tea, staring blankly at the TV. The news anchor's voice droned on about storms and traffic accidents, but I wasn't really listening. My mind wandered to the past. Those early days when Daniel and I couldn't keep our hands off each other, when laughter filled every corner of this house. Now, it felt like a museum of memories. The couch where we used to cuddle felt cold. The kitchen where we shared late-night snacks was now just another room I avoided. A sudden crash jolted me from my thoughts. I jumped, nearly spilling my tea. Came from upstairs. My heart raced as I set the cup down and stood, listening intently. For a moment, the only sound was the rain, but then it came again. A faint thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling slightly. No answer. Grabbing my phone, I hesitated before heading up the stairs. The creak of each step seemed deafening in the silence. I reached the top and turned toward the hallway, where the bedroom doors were slightly ajar. My son, Ethan, was supposed to be at his friend's house for a sleepover. Could he have come home early? "Ethan?" I called again, softer this time. I pushed open his door and found nothing but darkness. Everything was as it should be. His bed neatly made, his desk cluttered with papers and video game controllers. I moved to my own bedroom, the source of the noise, and hesitated before pushing the door open. The room was empty, but the window was ajar, rain blowing in and soaking the carpet. I frowned, stepping closer to close it. That's when I noticed it. A framed photo of Daniel and me on our wedding day, lying face down on the floor. It must have fallen from the nightstand. I picked it up, my fingers tracing the glass, now cracked down the middle. "Damn it!" I muttered under my breath. I set the photo back on the nightstand and shut the window, locking it this time. As I turned to leave, a strange sensation washed over me, like I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I glanced around the room, but there was no one there. Shaking my head, I chalked it up to my imagination and made my way back downstairs. The tea had gone cold by the time I sat back down. I checked my phone. No messages from Ethan or Daniel. Typical. I sighed, sinking deeper into the couch. The rain continued its relentless assault, and I found myself staring at the window, watching the droplets race each other down the glass. A knock at the front door shattered the quiet. My heart leapt into my throat. Who could it be at this hour? I checked the time, 11:47 p.m. Wrapping my cardigan tighter around me, I approached the door cautiously. Peeking through the peephole, I saw a figure standing under the porch light, their face obscured by the hood of a rain-soaked jacket. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's me, Mom," came the muffled reply. "Ethan." I opened the door, and there he was, drenched from head to toe. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his backpack hung limply from one shoulder. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" "I thought you were staying at Liam's tonight," I said, stepping aside to let him in. He shrugged, dropping his backpack by the door. "I wasn't feeling it. Thought I'd come home." I frowned. "You could have called. I was worried." "Sorry," he muttered, avoiding my gaze. He kicked off his sneakers and headed straight for the stairs. "Wait," I called after him. "Are you okay? Did something happen?" He paused, one foot on the bottom step. "I'm fine, Mom. Just tired." I wanted to press him further, but the look on his face stopped me. He looked troubled, like something was weighing heavily on his mind. But before I could say anything else, he disappeared upstairs, leaving me alone once again. I sat back down, the unease from earlier returning. Something about the way he avoided my eyes didn't sit right with me. Ethan wasn't the type to just show up unannounced, especially not in the middle of a storm. Minutes turned into hours, and before I knew it, the clock struck 2 a.m. Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the photo, the open window, and now Ethan's sudden return. It all felt connected somehow, though I couldn't piece it together. Finally, I decided to check on him. Maybe he'd fallen asleep, and I could tuck him in like I used to when he was little. The thought brought a small smile to my face as I climbed the stairs. His door was closed. I knocked softly. "Ethan? Are you awake?" No response. I turned the knob and peeked inside. The room was empty. His bed was untouched, and the window was wide open, rain soaking the carpet. My heart dropped. "Ethan?" I called out louder this time. I turned back to the hallway, my pulse quickening. The house was silent except for the sound of the rain. Panic set in as I checked every room, every corner, but he was nowhere to be found. And then I saw it. A wet footprint on the hardwood floor, leading toward the basement. "Ethan?" I called again, my voice shaking now. I followed the trail, each step heavier than the last. The basement door was ajar, the darkness beyond it yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the light switch. "Ethan, if this is some kind of joke, it's not funny," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. No reply. Taking a deep breath, I flipped the switch and descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The basement was cold, the air damp and heavy. I scanned the room, my eyes adjusting to the dim light, and then I saw him, standing in the corner with his back to me. His shoulders were hunched, his hands hanging limply at his sides. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't move. "Ethan, what are you doing down here?" I took a cautious step closer. When he finally turned around, his face was pale, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe? Or something darker. "Mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's someone in the house." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. My gaze darted around the dimly lit basement, searching for any sign of movement, any shadow that didn't belong. But there was nothing, just the hum of the old water heater and the faint drip of rainwater leaking through the cracks in the foundation. "Ethan," I said, my voice trembling, "what are you talking about? There's no one here." He shook his head, his eyes wide and glassy. "I saw him, Mom, upstairs. He was standing by the window in your room." My stomach twisted into a knot. "That's impossible. I was just up there. No one was there." "I know what I saw," he insisted, his voice growing louder. "He was there, watching." I took a step closer to him, my hands reaching out to steady him. His skin was cold to the touch, and I could feel him trembling beneath my grip. "Ethan, listen to me. You're safe. I'm here. There's no one else in this house." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. The memory of the broken photo frame, the open window, and now Ethan's strange behavior, it all felt too coincidental, too wrong. "Come on," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Let's go back upstairs. We'll lock all the doors and windows and I'll check the house again. Okay?" He hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the dark corners of the basement as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge. Finally, he nodded. "Okay." I led him back up the stairs, my heart pounding with every step. The house felt different now, heavier somehow, as though the walls were closing in around us. I locked the basement door behind us and turned to Ethan. "Stay here," I said. "I'll check the rest of the house." "No," he said quickly, grabbing my arm. "Don't leave me alone." His grip was firm, almost desperate. I looked into his eyes and saw the fear there, raw and unfiltered. "Okay," I said softly. "We'll check together." We moved through the house room by room, turning on every light as we went. The living room was empty, as was the kitchen. The dining room, the guest room, the bathrooms, nothing. No sign of anyone. Still, the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. When we reached my bedroom, Ethan hesitated at the door. "This is where I saw him," he whispered. I nodded, stepping inside first. The room was exactly as I had left it. The bed neatly made, the window locked, the photo frame back on the nightstand. I checked the closet, even under the bed, but there was nothing, just shadows and silence. "See," I said, turning to Ethan. "No one's here." He didn't look convinced. His eyes kept darting toward the window, as if expecting it to fly open at any moment. "He was there," he said again, his voice barely audible. "I know he was." I sighed, pulling him into a hug. "You've had a long day," I said, stroking his hair. "Maybe you just imagined it. The storm, the dark. It can play tricks on your mind." "I didn't imagine it," he mumbled against my shoulder. "Okay," I said, not wanting to argue. "Let's just get some rest. We can talk about it in the morning." He nodded reluctantly, and I led him to his room. He climbed into bed without a word, pulling the covers up to his chin. I sat on the edge of the bed, brushing his hair back from his forehead like I used to when he was little. "Try to sleep," I said softly. "I'll be right down the hall if you need me." "Don't turn off the light," he said quickly. I smiled faintly. "I won't." I left the bedside lamp on and closed the door halfway behind me. As I walked back to my own room, the weight of the night pressed down on me. I wanted to believe that Ethan was just imagining things, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. I climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to my chin. The rain had finally started to let up, the steady drumming on the windows fading into a soft patter. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, sent my heart racing. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Like footsteps, I sat up in bed, straining to listen. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then it came again, louder this time. Footsteps, unmistakable, coming from the hallway. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers fumbling as I unlocked it. I dialed Ethan's number, my hands shaking. The call went through, and I heard his phone ringing faintly from down the hall. "Ethan?" I whispered into the phone. "Mom." His voice was groggy, confused. "What's wrong?" "Stay in your room," I said quickly. "Don't open the door." "Do you hear me?" "Why? What's going on?" "Just do as I say," I said, my voice trembling. "I'll come to you. Stay put." I ended the call and slid out of bed, my bare feet hitting the cold floor. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a metal candle holder from the dresser, and crept toward the door. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was out there could hear it. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the crack under Ethan's door. I moved slowly, every step feeling like an eternity. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I reached Ethan's door and knocked softly. "It's me," I whispered. "Open up." The door creaked open, and Ethan stood there, his face pale and frightened. "Mom, what's happening?" "I don't know," I admitted, pulling him into a hug. "But we're going to be okay. We just need to stay together." "Do you think it's him?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I didn't want to answer. I didn't want to admit that I was just as scared as he was. "Let's go downstairs," I said instead. "We'll call the police." We made our way to the living room, every shadow feeling like it was watching us. I grabbed my phone and started dialing, but before I could hit call, the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and Ethan let out a small gasp. "It's okay," I said quickly, grabbing his hand. "It's just the storm. We'll use the flashlight on my phone." But as I turned on the light, something caught my eye, a figure standing just outside the window. A man, his face obscured by the rain, staring in at us. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "He's back." I froze, the beam of my phone's flashlight trembling as my hand shook. The figure outside the window didn't move. He just stood there, his face hidden by the shadows of the porch light. The rain streaked down the glass, distorting his outline, but I could see enough. Broad shoulders, a hood pulled low, and hands pressed flat against the window pane as if trying to push through. "Ethan?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Stay behind me." He didn't respond, but I felt his small hand clutching the back of my shirt, holding on tightly. My mind raced. What was he doing? Why wasn't he trying to break in? Was he waiting for something? Or someone? "Who are you?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't answer. He didn't even flinch. He just stood there, his head tilting slightly as though studying me. My pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out the sound of the rain. I wanted to run, to grab Ethan and hide, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. "Mom," Ethan whispered, his voice trembling. He's smiling." I squinted, trying to see through the rain and shadows. First, I thought Ethan was imagining things, but then I saw it. A slow, deliberate curve of his lips, a smile that sent a chill racing down my spine. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was something else entirely. Something wrong. I took a step back, pulling Ethan with me. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." We turned and bolted for the stairs, my phone's flashlight bouncing wildly as we ran. Behind us, I heard the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. He was in the house. "Go, Ethan," I shouted, pushing him ahead of me. "Get to your room and lock the door." "But what about you?" he cried, his voice breaking. "Just do it," I yelled, shoving him toward the top of the stairs. I turned back, my heart hammering as I pointed the flashlight toward the living room. The shards of broken glass glittered on the floor, and the rain was pouring in through the shattered window. But the man was gone. I scanned the room frantically, the beam of light darting across the walls and furniture. He couldn't have just disappeared. He had to be here somewhere. And then I heard it. A low, guttural laugh, coming from the darkness. "Mom!" Ethan screamed from upstairs. I spun around and sprinted up the stairs, taking them two at a time. When I reached the top, I saw Ethan standing in the hallway, pointing toward my bedroom. "He's in there," he cried. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed Ethan's arm and pulled him into his room, slamming the door behind us. My hands fumbled as I locked it, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "Under the bed," I said, shoving him toward the corner. "Hide. Now." "But do it," I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. Ethan crawled under the bed, his wide eyes staring up at me. I turned off the flashlight on my phone, plunging the room into darkness. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the candle holder I had grabbed earlier. Silence. The only sound was the rain pounding against the windows. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear any movement outside. For a moment, there was nothing, and then footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming down the hall. I held my breath, gripping the candle holder so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. "Mom!" Ethan whispered from under the bed. "He's here." I raised a finger to my lips, signaling him to stay quiet. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest as the doorknob rattled. He was trying to get in. "Go away," I screamed, my voice cracking. "Leave us alone." The rattling stopped. For a brief, agonizing moment, there was silence. And then, with a deafening crash, the door burst open. The man stood in the doorway, his face still obscured by the hood. But now I could see his eyes, cold, dark, and unblinking. He stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "Stay back," I shouted, raising the candle holder. "I'll hurt you, I swear." He didn't respond. He just kept coming, his smile widening. I swung the candle holder with all my strength, but he caught it mid-swing, his grip like iron. He wrenched it out of my hands and tossed it aside as though it weighed nothing. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking. "Don't hurt us." He tilted his head, as if considering my plea. And then, to my horror, he crouched down and looked under the bed. "Found you," he said, his voice low and gravelly.
No.
I screamed, throwing myself at him. I clawed at his face, his arms, anything I could reach, but he was too strong. He shoved me aside like I was nothing, his attention focused entirely on Ethan. Ethan scrambled out from under the bed, his face pale with terror. "Stay away from me," he cried, grabbing a lamp from the nightstand and hurling it at the man. It shattered against his chest, but he didn't even flinch. "Run, Ethan," I shouted, struggling to get back to my feet. Ethan bolted for the door, but the man was faster. He grabbed Ethan by the arm, yanking him back with a force that made him cry out in pain. "Let him go," I screamed, grabbing the first thing I could find, a heavy book, and slamming it against the back of the man's head. He grunted, releasing Ethan long enough for him to break free. "Go," I yelled, shoving Ethan toward the hallway. "Get out of the house. Run." Ethan hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. "I'm not leaving you. Just go," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. Ethan turned and ran, his footsteps echoing down the stairs. The man turned to me, his smile gone, replaced by something far more sinister. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice cold and flat. I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to buy Ethan time to keep this man focused on me. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't answer. He lunged at me and I barely had time to dodge. I grabbed the broken lamp from the floor and swung it at him, catching him across the jaw. He stumbled back, blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. "You're going to regret that," he growled, his voice low and menacing. I didn't wait for him to recover. I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it. I sprinted down the hall, my only thought to find Ethan and get us both out of the house. But as I reached the top of the stairs, I froze. Ethan was standing at the bottom, staring up at me, and behind him, emerging from the shadows, was another figure. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Behind Ethan, another figure stepped out of the shadows, tall and eerily calm. This one wasn't wearing a hood like the man upstairs. His face was fully visible, pale, gaunt, with sunken eyes that seemed to pierce through the dim light. His lips were thin and pressed into a line, as though he were suppressing a smile or something worse. "Ethan!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "Run!" Ethan turned, his eyes widening as he saw the figure behind him. He stumbled backward, his small body trembling with fear. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his head tilting slightly, studying Ethan like a predator sizing up its prey. "Mom!" Ethan cried, his voice breaking. "Help me!" I bolted down the stairs, my adrenaline overriding every ounce of fear. Halfway down, I grabbed the banister and leaned over, yelling at the man. "Stay away from him!" The figure's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of amusement in his expression, as if he found my defiance entertaining. Then, without a word, he took a step toward Ethan.
No.
I screamed, leaping down the last few stairs. I grabbed Ethan and pulled him behind me, shielding him with my body. My hands were shaking, my mind racing for a plan. Any plan. The man took another step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. "You shouldn't have come down," he said, his voice low and even. "Now it's too late." "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want from us?" He didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand and pointed at Ethan. "Him," he said simply. My blood ran cold. "You can't have him," I said, my voice firm despite the terror coursing through me. "You'll have to go through me first." The man smiled then, a slow, chilling smile that made my stomach churn. "That can be arranged." Before I could react, he lunged forward. I shoved Ethan toward the front door. "Run!" I screamed. "Go!" Don't stop. Ethan hesitated for a split second, his eyes wide with fear. Then he turned and bolted, fumbling with the lock on the door. The man reached for me, his hand closing around my wrist with a grip like iron. I cried out in pain, struggling to break free, but he was too strong. "Let me go!" I yelled, kicking at him with everything I had. My foot connected with his shin, and he grunted, loosening his grip just enough for me to wrench my arm free. I stumbled backward, grabbing a heavy vase from the console table and hurling it at him. It shattered against his shoulder, but he barely flinched. Ethan finally managed to unlock the door and threw it open. "Mom, come on!" he shouted, his voice desperate. I turned and ran toward him, but before I could reach the door, the man grabbed me again, yanking me back with a force that sent me crashing to the floor. Pain shot through my side as I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me. "Mom!" Ethan screamed, stepping back into the house. "Stay outside," I gasped, struggling to get up. "Don't come back in." But Ethan didn't listen. He grabbed an umbrella from the stand by the door and charged at the man, swinging it wildly. "Leave her alone!" he shouted, tears streaming down his face. The man turned, catching the umbrella mid-swing. He ripped it out of Ethan's hands and tossed it aside, his expression darkening. "You're brave," he said, his voice almost admiring. "But foolish. Get away from him!" I screamed, forcing myself to my feet. I grabbed a chair from the dining table and swung it at the man with all my strength. It hit him square in the back, and he staggered forward, giving Ethan just enough time to dart out of his reach. "Run, Ethan!" I shouted again, my voice hoarse. "Go to the neighbors. Call for help." Ethan hesitated, his small frame trembling. "I'm not leaving you," he cried. "Go!" I screamed, my voice breaking. "Please!" Tears streaming down his face. Ethan turned and ran out the door, disappearing into the rain-soaked night. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. The man turned back to me, his expression cold and calculating. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his tone almost bored. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, backing away. "What do you want with my son?" He didn't answer. Instead, he lunged at me again, faster than I expected. I tried to dodge, but he caught me by the arm and slammed me against the wall. Pain exploded in my shoulder, and I cried out, my vision swimming. "You should have stayed upstairs," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Now you've made me angry." I struggled against his grip, my mind racing. Couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him get to Ethan. Desperation gave me strength, and I lashed out, raking my nails across his face. He hissed in pain, releasing me just long enough for me to grab the broken leg of the chair I had smashed earlier. I swung it at him, the jagged wood catching him across the chest. He stumbled back, blood blooming through his shirt. For the first time, I saw something other than cold confidence in his eyes. Surprise. "You'll regret that," he growled, his voice dripping with venom. I didn't wait for him to recover. I turned and ran toward the door, my bare feet slipping on the rain-slick floor. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling and the rain coming down in sheets. I could barely see 2 feet in front of me, but I didn't care. I had to find Ethan. "Ethan!" I screamed, my voice barely audible over the storm. "Where are you?" Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard for a brief moment. I saw him then, running toward the neighbor's house, his small figure barely visible through the rain. Relief flooded through me, but it was short-lived. Behind me, I heard the sound of the man's footsteps, heavy and relentless, closing in. I turned, gripping the broken chair leg like a weapon. He emerged from the house, his movements slower now, his chest heaving. Blood dripped from the wound I had inflicted, but he didn't seem to care. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold and steady. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Stay away from us," I said, my voice trembling. "I'll kill you if I have to." He smiled again, that same chilling smile that made my skin crawl. You can try. He lunged at me, and I swung the chair leg with all my strength. It connected with his arm, and he let out a grunt of pain, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He grabbed me by the wrist, twisting it until I dropped my makeshift weapon. Let me go! I screamed, struggling against his grip. He didn't respond. Instead, he dragged me back toward the house, his grip like iron. I kicked and screamed, but it was no use. He was too strong. And then, out of nowhere, a blinding light flooded the yard. A car screeched to a halt in the driveway, its headlights cutting through the rain. The man froze, his grip on me loosening just enough for me to break free. Mom! Ethan's voice rang out, and I turned to see him climbing out of the car, followed by our neighbor, Mr. Harris, who was holding a shotgun. Get away from her! Mr. Harris shouted, leveling the gun at the man. For the first time, I saw fear in the man's eyes. He hesitated, his gaze darting between me and the shotgun. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the night, swallowed by the storm. The rain continued to pour heavily, each icy drop feeling like it was cutting through my skin. I stood there, gasping for breath, as if everything around me was suffocating under the weight of the panic that had just consumed us. The man had disappeared into the darkness, as swiftly as he had appeared. But I couldn't let my guard down. No one was safe, not while he was still out there somewhere. Mom! Ethan ran toward me, throwing his small arms around my waist, his tears mixing with the rain on his pale face. I dropped to my knees, pulling him into a tight embrace, feeling his heart racing almost as fast as mine. I was so scared, Mom. I thought he was going to take you. It's okay now, Ethan, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady even though my entire body was still trembling. We're safe. I'm here. I've got you. Mr. Harris stepped forward, his shotgun still raised, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows beyond the yard. I don't see him anymore, he said in a low, steady voice. He's gone, but we can't stay here. Come to my house before he comes back. I nodded without hesitation. Thank you, Mr. Harris. I don't know what we would have done without you. No need to thank me, he replied, his gaze still fixed on the darkness. This isn't over yet. We hurried away from the house, through the relentless downpour, and toward the warm glow of Mr. Harris's home. His house felt like a sanctuary, bright and safe compared to the cold, oppressive shadows of my own. As we stepped inside, I felt a flicker of relief, like I had just escaped a nightmare. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not yet. In Mr. Harris's living room, I wrapped Ethan and myself in a thick blanket. He was still trembling, but at least he wasn't crying anymore. Mr. Harris handed me a steaming cup of tea, his face lined with concern. I've lived here for over 30 years, he began, sitting across from me. But I've never seen anything like this. That man, he wasn't just some ordinary thief or intruder. What does he want with you and the boy? I shook my head, my throat tightening. I don't know. He didn't say much, but he wants Ethan. He said it, right in front of me. Mr. Harris's expression darkened, and he leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. This might not be just some random break-in. I looked at him, confused. What do you mean? He hesitated, as if trying to decide whether or not to say what was on his mind. Finally, he spoke. There are stories, old stories about these parts, about people who disappear, about things that can't be explained. I always thought they were just that, stories, but after tonight, I'm not so sure anymore. My stomach churned. You think he's not human? I don't know what to think, Mr. Harris admitted. But I do know one thing. He'll be back. The weight of his words settled over me like a heavy fog. I glanced at Ethan, who was curled up on the couch next to me, his eyes drooping with exhaustion. He was just a child. He didn't deserve this, whatever this was. The night dragged on, every creak of the house and every gust of wind outside making my heart race. Mr. Harris stayed awake, his shotgun resting on his lap as he sat by the window, keeping watch. I didn't sleep either. couldn't. My mind replayed every moment, every word, every terrifying second of the encounter with that man. Why Ethan? Why us? As dawn began to break, the rain finally eased, leaving the world outside eerily quiet. I felt a sliver of hope. Maybe the man was gone for good. Maybe we could finally move on. But deep down, I knew better. By mid-morning, the police arrived. Mr. Harris had called them the night before, but the storm had delayed their response. 2 officers, a man and a woman, stepped into the house, their uniforms damp from the lingering drizzle. "We understand there was an intruder," the male officer said, his tone professional but kind. "Can you tell us what happened?" I recounted everything, the man at the window, the chase, the fight. As I spoke, I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They thought I was exaggerating or worse, imagining things. But Mr. Harris backed me up, his voice firm and unwavering. "This wasn't just some drunk or a petty thief," he told them. "This was something else, something dangerous." The officers exchanged a glance, then nodded. "We'll file a report and keep an eye on the area," the female officer said. "But if this man comes back, don't hesitate to call us. And make sure your doors and windows are secured." Secured. As if locks and bolts could stop someone like him. The next few days were a blur. Ethan and I stayed with Mr. Harris, too afraid to return to our own home. The police patrolled the neighborhood, but there was no sign of the man. It was as if he had vanished without a trace. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting. On the 3rd night, I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The house was silent, but something felt wrong. I slipped out of bed and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. First, I saw nothing. Just the empty street, illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. But then, in the shadows at the edge of the yard, I saw him. He was standing perfectly still, his face obscured by the darkness. But I knew it was him. I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unrelenting. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't move. He didn't make a sound. He just stood there, as if daring me to come outside. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking. I wanted to scream, to wake Mr. Harris, to grab Ethan and run. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The next morning, I made a decision. We couldn't stay here. Not in this house, not in this town. I didn't know who or what that man was, but I knew he wouldn't stop. Not until he got what he wanted. "Mom, where are we going?" Ethan asked as I packed our bags. "Somewhere safe," I said, forcing a smile. "Somewhere he can't find us." Mr. Harris tried to convince me to stay, to let him help, but I couldn't take the risk. I couldn't put him or anyone else in danger. By the time the sun set, Ethan and I were on the road, leaving everything behind. I didn't know where we were going, only that we had to keep moving. As we drove, I glanced at Ethan in the rearview mirror. He was staring out the window, his face pale but calm. I reached back and squeezed his hand. "We're going to be okay," I said, more to myself than to him. But as the miles stretched on and the darkness closed in around us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed. Somewhere out there, he was still watching, still waiting, and I knew this wasn't the end.